Good evening. At tonight's edition of At HydePark, here in our studios, we feature the former chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the former chairman of Sri Lanka Tourism, as well as the convener of the Patriotic Professionals Forum, Dr. Nalaka Godahewa. Good evening and a warm welcome.
Good evening.
It's a long time since we had a discussion with you, and it's nice to have you here. But since your expertise are quite widespread, and you talk about politics, economics, the Sri Lankan situation in Geneva, I'd like to start off asking you a general question about how you assess the current economic situation.
Okay. In my opinion, the economic situation cannot be worse than this. Why I say so? 2014, the last year under the previous government, before the current government came to power, in almost every economic indicator, we were rated either number 1 or number 2 in whole of South Asia. We were doing well. And that situation has completely changed. Today, after 3.5 years of the Yahapalana government, we are doing badly in almost every indicator. Look at the GDP growth rate, which was hovering around 7% at that time, gradually came down, and last year it was only 3.1%. The rupee has devalued. We have lost jobs. The cost of living has skyrocketed. So in every aspect, we are having problems. Industries are suffering. Businesses are suffering. Foreign investments are not coming anymore. Businesses are getting closed down. Almost all the large corporations are showing losses. So economy is in trouble.
When you say FDIs are not coming in, I think the government said that last year there was $1.63 billion in foreign direct investment inflows into the country, and this being the highest ever recorded figure, doubling from about $802 million achieved in 2016. But how would you say that FDIs are not flowing into the country?
That information is in a way correct, in a way wrong. Why I say in a way correct? Yes, that investment came to the country. Why I say it is wrong? None of them are new investments. They are the tail end of the investments that they came long before they came to power. For example, if you take Shangri-La project, came to Sri Lanka under the previous government. Still, Shangri-La investment is coming. If you look at that 1.6 billion or whatever they were talking about in 2017, 95% of that are part of the previous investments. I have done the calculation to see only $17 million have come as fresh investments. So that's a ridiculous state of affairs. In 2014, we had $1.5 billion foreign direct investment coming. 2017, if you look at the fresh investments, that is less than 20 billion. So this is something to worry about.
Also, when you talk about the current situation in the economy, I think you said it's in crisis. But again, the government's concern currently is that most of the debt stock that they it is a burden to the country, and that was accumulated during the previous regime, to which you were very much involved as an official.
Completely misleading information once again. What was the debt situation when this government came to power? If you look at from Sri Lankan rupee terms, it was something like 7,391 billion overall debt situation in 2014. That is debt collected under so many governments, not just one government, under so many governments. Since then, by end of 2017, after 3 years later, the debt situation had gone up to 10,313,000,000, 40% increase. 40% increase in 3 years. Of course, the Sri Lanka is currently in serious debt, but 40% of that is due to the current government.
But their concern is that they are working hard to work about this to make sure that the debt repayment process is in line. However, they keep saying that there is a lot of mismanagement that has come forth. What do you have to say from an economic perspective?
Look, from a company's point of view, if a new CEO takes over and if he sees the companies in debt, what would he do? He will cut cost. He will try to bring the debt situation down. So if this government did the same thing as a government, the debt situation should have improved. The overall debt should have come down, but instead it has gone up. That means this government is doing exact opposite of what they are supposed to be doing. You can't increase the debt by 40% and still be complaining about the previous government. That was after almost 65 years since independence, 7,391 billion debt. Just 3 years later, it has shot up by 40%. And in fact, the government auditor says even this information is incorrect. He says the actual debt situation is about 10 billion 700,000 or something. He says the central bank reports are wrong. So that is why I'm saying the government is misleading the public. These people have borrowed far more than any other government did in the past. The question is, having borrowed, what have they done? Now if you look at the previous government, yes, they borrowed. They borrowed and they invested bulk of that for development. You can see in your own eyes what was done with that money. The harbour, the airport, the highways, power plants, irrigation projects, all those things. Now these people, having borrowed 40% of that amount during the last 3 years, tell me something that you see. You don't see anything.
I think moving on to also, since we are touching on economics, about an export-oriented economy. This is something that respective governments have been talking about. But do you think the policy framework is in place to spur an export-driven economy in the country?
See, when you say what we want, we all governments want exports to go up. If you look at our import-export situation, we import about 20 billion worth of goods, export about 10 billion US dollars. That is 50% of imports. So who has to export? The industries have to export. The business people have to export. What has the government done during the last 3 years to encourage businesses, encourage entrepreneurs? They've actually killed business enthusiasm. I mean, from the time they came to power, starting from the interim budget that was introduced in March 2015, from every budget, they messed with the succession system. The businessmen were shocked with the inconsistency in the policies. Then the interest rates have gone up significantly, almost double during the last 3 years. So with these things, how can you do business? That is why today all businesses are suffering. So how can you develop exports like that?
But Enterprise Sri Lanka, launched by the government, I think that has a more holistic approach to these issues. But according to what you say, do you think they can actually get it right with this Enterprise Sri Lanka vision and policy directive?
If you look at the current government, and particularly its leaders, the president, the prime minister, they're great storytellers. They're great storytellers. I think they shouldn't have been in politics. They should have been fiction writers. Because from the time they came to power, they keep talking about future. They never talk about the past, no, other than somebody else's past. They never talk about what they did. They are always talking about what they are going to do. So this Enterprise Sri Lanka is also another story. Now, if you look at economic policy, it's a government which introduced 9 economic policy documents during the last 3 years, has just come up with a story. So this is the 10th one. So the question is whether they will actually deliver. My feeling is they will not deliver, because these are only stories which has no practical purpose and no plan to implement. If they do, we'll wait and see. I mean, when you talk about somebody's performance, you always look at their past. This government hasn't performed for the last 3 years. So why should we believe that this Enterprise Sri Lanka thing will work? And on the other hand, all those things that they're talking about under Enterprise Sri Lanka were already there. I mean, when they came to power, Sri Lanka was a thriving economy. We were growing at 7%, and we were the second fastest growing economy in the country, in the whole of Asia, next to China. So everything that they're talking about in this program were already there. Cities were coming up, villages were coming up, jobs were created, and for 3 years, we saw nothing happening. We lost everything that we were doing. And now they're talking about doing exactly what was there 3 years before, and let's hope they will do so. But I doubt it.
Talking about growth and economy, I think economic growth was around 3.3%, and we're not expecting anything more than 4.5%. Government has its reasons. They still talk about debt, etc., as we discussed earlier. But I'd like to know from you, going forward, what should the government do in order to bring about meaningful development, meaningful growth that will trickle down to all segments of the country, the rural economy and also the cities?
I think you use the right word. All segments must benefit. No? Whatever the economic policy you may talk about, at the end of the day, it must be for people. No? If you forget the fact that all economic developments are finally to benefit all the people, it is meaningless. The problem with this government, they have not understood that. They have not understood the common person's needs. And the solutions that they're talking about is far-fetched as a result. What we need now is somebody to go back, probably a future government, come up with an economic development plan which will benefit everybody. It is not just GDP growth. It is not just a few companies making profits. It must be something that is people-centric, where the benefit of the economic development must be distributed amongst as many people as possible. So that is what we should be looking at, and I'm sure future governments will take that approach.
But this SME sector too, the development of SME has been something that once again governments talk about. But do we have that SME development in place?
There are a lot of plans for SME development. If you look at 2014, for example, by that time, something like 55% of our GDP was created by SME sector. Something like almost 70% of the jobs were created by the SME sector. Self-employment was encouraged through programs like Divina Gum, etc. So there was a lot of focus on the SME sector, and that is the right way to approach. As I said earlier, you must not focus on few companies and large corporates. You must create opportunities everywhere. So SME sector is very, very important for a country like ours. But the problem is the current government has completely neglected that. Look at what they did from the time they came in terms of taxation, in terms of increasing interest, in terms of inconsistent policies in every aspect. The SME sector has been hit. Now they are even going to increase the company registration so the new companies will not be encouraged. The charges are increased, annual charges are increased for the existing companies. So how can we develop SME sector like that?
Dr. Godahewa, I'd like to divert your attention to more of the international arena, where Sri Lanka has faced a lot of criticism over our alleged conduct on the final stages of the conflict here in Sri Lanka, and resolutions have come forth, and then the final one was co-sponsored by the government. What is your current view, especially a key party to the resolution, the United States, withdrew from the global body, calling it a cesspool of bias. But at this stage, what do you think should be the government's course of action?
It is very interesting that United States withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council. And they say Human Rights Council is biased. And this is exactly what we were saying for the last 3 years. From the time our government went and co-sponsored a resolution in Geneva along with United States of America. What happened there was United States of America tried to introduce a resolution which was against Sri Lanka, and that was based on wrong information, based on reports that were done outside Sri Lanka, giving a lot of false information. And what Sri Lankan government should have done at that stage was to say, okay, wait, let us look at the report. Let us see the content. And if they did so, they would have figured out most of the information in that report was incorrect. But they didn't do that. Just because America wanted to propose a resolution, just to please America and the Western countries, few Western countries, they went and participated in that process. In doing so, caused a lot of harm to the country. But at least now that the America has withdrawn from that, there's an opportunity for Sri Lanka government also to withdraw from the resolution, because that is not good for Sri Lanka. I mean, we are basically admitting that we have committed something, a kind of a crime, which we never actually committed. We did so just to please these other countries. At least now we must go and correct our good name. Of course, in this resolution there are good things. I mean, that is undeniable. There are certain things that from a human rights point of view a country should do. Doing those things you can do anyway. You don't need to agree to a resolution to do that.
Government says by agreeing to work closely with parties outside the country, that they've brought a fresh perspective to foreign relations between Sri Lanka, and also some sort of respect to Sri Lanka's conduct, and the fact that also that these countries would look at the country afresh. What have you got to say about it?
That is ridiculous. No, I come and say you are a criminal. Just to please me, you accept that you are a criminal and say now we have a great relationship because you and I both agree on the same thing. But in that agreement, you have been present to the whole world as a criminal. This is what happened through this Geneva resolution. You can't come and say that we have built better relationships by agreeing for something which is incorrect. The whole basis of resolution was that we committed war crimes. By agreeing to that, are we going to say that we actually committed war crimes? No, we didn't. So I think it is very wrong to say that we improved our relationships with the Western world by agreeing to that. I mean, if you are a proud country, which is proud of your heritage, which know exactly what you did, we should have never agreed to that.
A recent discussion I had with Lord Naseby of the House of Lords of the UK, he brought out that the United Kingdom too should come out of this resolution, especially because of the conduct of the Western countries in relation to smaller nations. You'll be in Geneva soon. How would you maybe argue your case from a small organization point of view?
Every time we go to Geneva, representing a small group of Sri Lankans in our private capacity, we talk about these things. We challenge the base challenge of this resolution. Let's go back to what Lord Naseby said. He was pointing out an inaccuracy in the report that was the basis for this resolution. That inaccuracy is the assumption that during the last phases of the war, more than 40,000 civilians, primarily Tamils, died, which is a ridiculous statement. Because even the American ambassador at that time, who was in Sri Lanka, had written in his own reports, it is somewhere around 3,000 civilians. And all the evidence that we have say it is somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000. Of course, at a war there could be civilian casualties. So, but that number is something similar to something close to 3,000. Now, somebody who never set foot in Sri Lanka wrote that it was 40,000. And that became finally official document. A resolution was introduced based on that. That is the number that we should have challenged. Out of many inaccuracies in that original report which was presented to UNHCR, see, this is one example which Lord Naseby has been talking about.
But are we still in a position to challenge those facts that are included?
Of course, why not? It's the duty of the government to challenge, and it is very easy to prove. But the problem is our government, without challenging that, just admitted that, agreed to that. How wrong is that?
Right. If moving away from that international arena, but also within the country, we talk about reconciliation and post-war development. A recent statement made by a Northern Chief Minister, C.V. Vigneswaran, about war memorials, he pointed out that these memorials in the north hurt the sentiments of the Tamil people, and also Minister Mano Ganesan backed his statement by saying he's in agreement. But how do you think we can bring both communities together for a meaningful reconciliation as one nation without hurting sentiments of any party in the way forward?
We can never bring about real reconciliation with this kind of statements. People like Mr. Vigneswaran, Chief Minister of the Northern Province, they are simply doing politics. They are spreading hatred to harvest that for their political gains. Now, when were these memorials were put up? That was almost 8 years ago, right? Now, suddenly he has remembered this, and suddenly he sees this as a problem. In fact, he is trying to bring this to the minds of the people, so that people will start talking about that. I think politicians shouldn't be doing that. That politicians should be talking about the real problems of Jaffna people. What are the real problems of Jaffna people? Now we are in touch with a lot of Tamils in the north. They have problems like lack of jobs. There are no industries. Indian fishermen encroaching their seas. There's no water for their agriculture. And these are the problems the politicians must be focusing on. And in fact, they can find solutions for this because they were in power for the last more than 3 years now, Mr. Vigneswaran, and they get money allocated for development of the north. Instead of spending that money and doing something for the people, he's creating hatred like this. And coming back to these memorials, I like to call them not as war memorials. I like to call them memorials of a humanitarian operation. What we saw there was a humanitarian operation. Can't you remember that 290,000 people were held as stages, used as a human shield? Those are the people who were rescued by the Sri Lankan armed forces. Sri Lankan armed forces were fighting against a group of terrorists. They were not fighting against Tamils. There was no war against Tamils. It was a battle between a legitimate armed force and a group of terrorists. From that, armed forces won, and eventually the people won. People were saved, and in that, nearly more than 27,000 soldiers died. More than 14,000 soldiers got disabled. And somebody has to remember them also, no? Now today if you go and remove those memorials, how hurting would that be in the south? The people who are relatives of those who died, people who are friends of those who died, how are they going to feel? Won't it create more hatred? And this is why I think people like Mr. Vigneswaran should be asked to stop this nonsense and concentrate on what they are actually supposed to be doing.
I think what was brought out by even Minister Manogan's statement was that the JVP activists, there was no such memorial for them, and these commemorations were gone, were not actually a focus. But as we talk about these war memorials matter once again, Dr. Godahewa, what do we do as a country to bring communities together and also make sure the recent act of hatred and extremism, and I think there were issues in Kandy, events in Kandy that followed. What do we do as a country, irrespective of party politics, to bring the people together?
Actually, if there are no party politics, there won't be this problem. All these problems are always created by party politics. It's always some politician using this the community issue to gain political power. My personal feeling is the main answer, not the only answer, the main answer for all these problems is economic development. If you look at what happened in the south and as well as the north, why youth decided to fight is because of the economic problems. And if a government focuses on that, find solutions for their real problems, the employment, opportunities to develop their businesses, most of these problems will be forgotten and people will concentrate on their livelihood. And particularly in the north, as I mentioned earlier, that is what Tamil politicians should do if they are really interested in this. And that is what Sri Lanka, the southern politicians also should do if they are really interested in reconciliation. Go and help those people to have economic freedom. When there's economic freedom, most of these problems will be forgotten.
Talking about economic freedom, the previous regime, what measures do you think has been continued in the northern and eastern provinces in terms of developing and reviving the devastated economies of those two parts of our country?
See, if you look at the approach adopted by the former government, for in the north as well as south, it was the same approach. We were living in a country which was affected by war for a long period. In 2005, when President Mahinda Rajapaksa came to power, the infrastructure was in a very, very poor state. We didn't have even proper electricity in the country. Power cuts, you remember? There were no roads. We had only one hub, one airport. The electricity, water supply was very poor. And he realized that when you talk about economic development, the first task is to get the infrastructure up. So he invested heavily and develop infrastructure. That is why highways came, that is why harbours came, that is why power plants came, that is why irrigation projects came. And the same approach was adopted in North after the war. And if you look at 2009-2014 period, I think bulk of development took place in North and East because they were the most affected in terms of poor infrastructure. And once you do that, that is hardware. Once you provide that hardware, the next thing is software. Software is going and bringing industries, creating employment, giving opportunities for people for self-employment, etc. And that software part, unfortunately, was little late, and also the election came before everything was completed. What the current government should have done was they should have used that hardware and concentrated on software. But unfortunately, they didn't do that. If you look at the last 3.5 years, nothing has happened in the North or East in terms of software. That is the problem we are still suffering.
And in Sri Lanka, policy consistency has been a concerning concern. In fact, respective governments that follow do not have a proper framework that they follow. But was this the same with the previous regime too?
The lack of policy consistency is a historical problem for us. We got our independence in 1948. Since then, we have had, I think, more than 12 different governments. And these different governments have had different economic policies, sometimes extreme policies. Some are far to the far left, some to the far right. Of course, with that kind of inconsistency, it is very difficult to develop a country. If you look at other countries in Asia, which got developed like Singapore, Malaysia, the advantage they had was they had long durations under one leadership, one policy. Unfortunately, we didn't have that. If you look at the last government, they were in power. In a way, you can say for 20 years, out of which 9 years under President Mahinda Rajapaksa. And particularly during the latter part, there were some very clear-cut policies because he had laid down his policies in Mahinda Chintanan. So everybody knew what he stood for. Everybody knew in the government administration what they were supposed to be doing. So that is why there were clear development. The economy grew by 4 times, from $20 billion in 2005 to $80 billion in 2014. That was a remarkable development. Unfortunately, government changed in 2015 and we started trying out different things. It's not just one thing. We are trying out different things almost every 3 months. So with this kind of inconsistency, we are in serious trouble.
Dr. Godahewa, I think continuing on the discussion we had prior to the short break we had, if we move on to talk about free trade agreements, how do you think as a country as small as Sri Lanka should embark on these agreements? I particularly ask this because there have been a lot of controversy surrounding the recent free trade agreement with Singapore, and there is also a lot of talk about extending and expanding on existing FTAs while also embarking with other countries in the region for newer agreements. What is this controversy? Aren't free trade agreements good and beneficial for a small nation as ours?
See, in a globalized environment, you can't avoid trade agreements. Sometimes they are kind of forced upon you that you have to come to trade agreements if you want to benefit from globalization. But what is important is when you enter a trade agreement, there has to be a negotiation. The negotiation is between two parties, and the two parties should know exactly what they're looking for. They negotiate and come to a compromise. As long as it is done, the final outcome is likely to be benefiting both parties one way or the other. The current controversy, particularly about the Singapore trade agreement, must be understood in that context. What happened with the Singapore trade agreement is a team from Sri Lanka was trained by Singaporeans how to negotiate trade agreements. And then, after getting that learning, you go and negotiate with Singapore. Who is negotiating with you? The same people who taught you how to negotiate. Can you see how ridiculous this state of affairs is? This is exactly what happened. Singaporeans taught our team how to negotiate, and they went and negotiated with their teachers. And they agreed on a trade agreement, which when you read is totally one-sided. It is not a properly negotiated trade agreement.
But what's so detrimental for the country?
It is so detrimental because the terms in that are totally one-sided. Take for example, once the agreement was signed, Singapore government announced that per year they are going to get US dollar 10 billion benefit out of that trade agreement. Has Sri Lankan government got anything to say about that? Sri Lankan government didn't announce anything. Sri Lankan government didn't say that we can quantify the benefit because there's no benefit for Sri Lanka. See, the problem is, as I started earlier, the problem is not having a trade agreement. The problem is the way you negotiate. Do you know what you are asking for? That is why the professionals who are talking against this agreement, particularly the GMOA, Dr. Padani and that team, they are saying the right thing. What they say is, if you want to negotiate trade agreements, first of all, get your national policy right. Once you have a national policy on trade agreements, you know what you're looking for. And without that, don't go and negotiate. They don't tell not to negotiate. They don't tell not to have trade agreement. Even I'm not saying that. I don't say that we don't need trade agreement. We need. But the trade agreements must benefit both parties. The problem is the current government is signing trade agreement for the sake of signing. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, no wonder, because this is the most incompetent government that ever came to power since independence in this country. They don't know what they're doing. That is why they are in this misery today. That is why this economy is struggling today. So the most incompetent people who came to power in this country have negotiated a trade agreement with Singapore, which is a disaster. That is what professionals are complaining about.
Also about bringing down professionals and the movement of people, professionals from respective countries who have inked these trade agreements. I remember Dr. Harsha De Silva saying that there is no such affair that has been agreed upon through this FTA, especially because Mode 4, there is no such allowance. What have you got to say about that?
Dr. Harsha De Silva doesn't know who was the president of this country in 2005. Very recently, I saw at one of your own programs, Ada Derana TV, he's complaining that the previous, in 2004, President Rajapaksa signed an agreement with Pakistan. He was not the president at that time. Then this is the same Dr. Harsha De Silva who spoke about the Volkswagen factory in this country. So don't bring Dr. Harsha De Silva as an example for these things. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? He has not read this agreement. We have read this agreement. The professionals in this country have studied these agreements. We know these problems are there. That is why we are talking about that. So the last example that you must bring is something that Dr. Harsha De Silva spoke about.
Right. So I think moving on, Dr. Godahewa, we'd like to talk a little about tourism, especially you as the chairman of Sri Lanka Tourism back then. We see a lot of development that the government envisages in terms of increasing arrivals. We have targets have been set every year by every government. But do we have that infrastructure to market our country as that destination, the destination that we look for as a global tourism destination?
Tourism is an important subject that we must talk about, because if you look at the natural advantages Sri Lanka has developed various industries, in my opinion, tourism has the #1 potential. It has the highest potential to develop as an industry because so many advantages we have here. But unfortunately, tourism was badly affected until 2009 because of the war. People didn't want to come to Sri Lanka because it was a safe destination. But after the end of the war, the government prepared a tourism development plan, which intended of taking the tourism arrivals, which was hovering around 400,000 at that time, to 2.5 million by 2016. And that was a very clear plan which basically identified what the government has to do and the private sector has to do. Responsibilities were clearly identified, and in that, infrastructure development was key. For example, if you are targeting 2.5 million tourism arrivals, how many hotel rooms you need by that time? How many trained staff you need by that time? How are you going to provide transportation facilities within the country for these tourists? And also, how do you connect with markets across the globe to bring tourists to the country. So all these things were discussed in the strategic plan, and the plan was getting implemented. Tourism arrivals started growing. Even I was tourism chairman for about 2 years before I moved to SCC. I couldn't finish my full tenure because there was a requirement for me to move to SCC. But during that time, the tourist arrivals grew from 450,000 to about 1.5 million. So we were very much on target. And we had put in place a one-stop shop for giving approval for hotels, so that it was made convenient for businessmen to come and make investments. Things are happening. But since then, I don't see a proper plan for tourism development any longer. We are looking for ad hoc solutions here and there. We are spending money on promotion, but that again I don't know whether we are doing it in the right place. We have meddled with our airline, and we have cut down routes from which we are actually bringing tourists to the country, particularly the European routes. With all these things, today tourism industry is stagnant. That we can see when you go to hotels. Hotel occupancy is low. Companies' profitability is low. But this is an industry which can easily be turned around. All you need is somebody to be focused and work for about 3 years on this proper tourism development plan. We can get back to normal.
There has also been concern about Sri Lanka having a clear policy in terms of how we market ourselves. There were changes of taglines, I think, during your tenure too. But do you think this affects our industry in terms of how we market ourselves?
Actually, when it comes to tagline, I must say this government also didn't meddle with the tagline. They used the same tagline that was introduced during my tenure, Refreshing Sri Lanka, Wonder of Asia. Before that, there were a couple of changes before I assumed duties as Chairman Tourism in 2011. I think that's a good tagline. And what is more important is what we sell, the value proposition of this country. The value proposition of Sri Lanka is the authenticity, the diversity, and the compactness. It's within a small country, there's so much diversity, and it's an authentic destination with a 2,500 year-long history. The question is, from where do you bring tourists? That we must understand. You must understand the world tourism, outbound tourism growth in the world, and see where the potential is. For example, China. Today they send 180 million tourists out. Right? Europe is declining. Middle East is somewhat growing. India is a growth market. So you need to know where the growth markets are and create a match between these expectations from tourists from these countries and what can offer. We have a natural product, but there are certain things that you still have to do. For example, sports adventure, then the transportation facilities. If you get these things right, bulk of the things that the tourists are looking for, we already have. That is why I say this is the highest potential industry.
Moving away to talk about state assets too, I think this is a concern as the Patriotic Professionals Forum that you raised. The government's point of view is once again that if we take to talk about the Mattara International Airport and the Hambantota Port, the government says they were never viable projects. But your concern is that national assets are put forth for other ventures by international partners. But what is really wrong here?
What is really wrong is a total lack of understanding of modern economics by this government. This government has no clue about economics. Today, a lot of countries have learned through experience the changes that are happening in the economic world. There was a time people believed in state control. There was a time people believed in open economies. Today, most of the countries have started realizing that there has to be a balance between these two. The classic example is socialist market economies adopted by China under President Xi Jinping, which is doing far better than any other economy in the world. They have realized to develop an economy of a country, you need to call an invisible hand and a visible hand both. What is invisible hand? Invisible hand is the market forces. You can't control. It is open. The market drives. That's the invisible hand. But at the same time, they have realized there has to be a visible hand also. Visible hand is the state. The state has to control, state has to build infrastructure. And without those things, the market forces alone cannot work out. Classic example, take Alibaba, the largest e-commerce company in China. If China said, okay, we believe in market economy and allow market forces to do everything and sat and did nothing, would Alibaba become world's #1 company like this? No. The government went and developed infrastructure. The e-commerce was developed by the government. The telecommunication network going all over the country, making infrastructure, facilitating, that was done by the government. Then Alibaba can come and thrive on that. So that is the invisible hand, the visible hand, working hand in hand. In Sri Lanka, it's the same situation. Now, if you want to develop our outbound logistics in this industry, we need huge investments into ports, airports. Is private sector going to do that? Do you think private sector companies will come and build a single port in this country? Single airport in this country? They will never do that. They will come and make use of the facilities. That is what the previous government understood. They realized if you want to develop the economy, the government has to come and provide the infrastructure. That is why they invested in telecommunications, and that is why they invested in ports, airports, highways and all those things. And the private sector was supposed to make use of those infrastructure and do commerce. Now this government is coming in and selling the infrastructure we have. They are giving it to the private sector. Thereafter it will be managed the way those private companies want. That will never be open for the whole country. So they have completely lost track of what previous government was doing, and they have not understood. They have created a mess out of everything we had.
But before we wrap up, I think I'd also like to touch a little about the Securities and Exchange Commission, your tenure. There has been a lot of controversy surrounding that, as back then when you were chairman of the SEC, you did voice that there were no issues at the SEC under your tenure, but there were also certain arrests made in connected to this. But what have you got to say about the CSE's way forward? Why isn't the country's market picking up? There is allegation that there were irregularities back then. What do we need to do now?
I became chairman of SEC in 2012, mid-2012. I was chairman SEC till end 2014. During that period, I say with a lot of responsibility, there were never a single allegation about SEC or Colombo stock market. Even today, now I left 3 years ago, still today, now this government had been in power, still today there's not a single allegation about anything that happened during that period, because we regulated the market the way we were supposed to be doing. And the most important thing is not only that we regulated it well, the market grew rapidly during that period. When I took over, the Colombo oil price index was around 6,200 or something, but it had gone up to 7,300 during the period that I was the chairman, and the market was thriving, and we had all the plans to make it one of the best markets in whole of Asia. In fact, we won an award in 2014 as the most sustainable stock market in whole of Asia. But since then, this government has again, unfortunately, completely messed it up. The oil share price index was 7,300 in December 2014. What is it today? Today, if you look at it, is 6,000. So it should be 9,000 by now. It should have improved, and that hasn't happened because once again, you don't understand your job. The regulators don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They are discouraging investors. Investors are fleeing the market. Trading has come down, and it is not doing the job what it is supposed to be doing for the economy. There's a huge role that the stock market has to play to support the national economy. Of course, the national economy is also struggling. That is also reflected in the stock market. So there are two things. On one side, the overall economy is performing bad. That is reflected in the stock market. And also regulators don't know their job. That is also reflected in the stock market.
Once again, I'd like to take a little moment to ask you, as the chairman of SEC back then, I think you'd have more perspective into this. What do we do now to resurrect the CSE, given its current trends that you talk of? What policy should the SEC bring forth?
SEC had a 10-point action plan in 2014. And also SEC had presented on the 5th January 2015 a vision for 2020, a very, very clear program of action. All SEC has to do is forget about your political difference, go back, revisit that plan and implement.
Right. I think on that note, it's time to wrap up at Hyde Park tonight. We'll see you again next Thursday at the same time. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.